This is from opendemocracy.net. It's a little piece called Reflections, Antisemitism, Anti-imperialism, and Liberal Communitarianism by Marcel Stoetzler. There's a little, this is the subtitle of it, or brief explanation of it. In the current European context, associations between left-wing movements and the far right, anti-cosmopolitan, quote, revolt against modernity, end quote, are very much fringe phenomenon. Everything should be done to keep it that way. Okay, here's a little explanation. I don't know, it's in italics, so I guess it's a little abstract on this article. It's probably, this little abstract's probably the size of like a tenth of the article, so it's funny. The politically explosive modern form of anti-Semitism is the one that is central to the modern conservative revolutionary reaction to modernity. Two of the key problems in the analysis of and struggle against anti-Semitism are: to what extent does the modern right-wing critique of capitalist modernity overlap with its left-wing counterpart, and why does the latter sometimes fail to distinguish itself unambiguously from this mortal enemy? In varying contexts, from the Weimar Communist Party of Germany, via Foucault on Iran, to contemporary labor politicians, some on the left grant too much to their enemies' enemies, and are perhaps too fuzzy in their thinking to distinguish their longing for the community of an emancipated future from their enemies' longing for the racially or spiritually purified, reborn community of whichever reactionary fantasy. The principal strength and attraction of anti-Semitism lies in its... Okay, that was the little introduction. Okay, now here's the actual article. The principal strength and attraction of anti-Semitism lies in its being beyond ordinary politics. Anti-Semitism is meta-political. Both on the right and the left, anti-Semitism's value is that it connects to the opposite side. The ambiguous meaning of the word, quote, socialism, end quote, in its name was one of National Socialism's strengths. Although Hitler made clear enough that his was a socialism, quote, the German way, end quote, namely without the corrosive Jewish Marxist bits about class struggle. Although its specifics put Nazism in many respects into a category all of its own, it also belongs into the wider category of nationalist socialisms that affirm the capitalist mode of production, but are, quote, anti-capitalistic in their rejection of this or that detail of capitalist circulation and reproduction. Greedy bankers who behave like locust swarms, that kind of thing, and seek a solution to the, quote, social question, end quote, at the level of the nation. There are many of those, and they are not about to go away. They are by nature receptive to anti-Semitism if and when it seems opportune for whichever contextual, cultural, historical reasons. The anti-imperialism of the metropolitan left that indulges even the most abhorrent of, quote, my enemy's enemies, end quote, acts out on the canvas of the, quote, Orient, end quote, the communitarian imaginary which at home, due to the practical requirements of capitalist statecraft, tends to be muted. Quote, empowerment, end quote, of the, quote, communities, end quote. Historically, a speciality of British administration of subject peoples in the key of divide and rule, has returned to the metropole mostly at the local level, in the form of the multiculturalist administration of large cities. Not incidentally, in this area, Ken Livingstone is much more of an expert than in German history. The strategic embrace at the level of world politics of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas and Hezbollah, is mirrored at the political micro-level by the communitarian mode of multiculturalist policy that was in Britain pioneered by Livingstone's Greater London Council in the 1980s. The shared ground that makes possible the metapolitics of anti-Semitism, is characterized by the emphasis on community over class struggle, totality over fragmentation. Antisemitism, with its boundary-transcending and taboo-breaking mystique, is the signature of those who aim to transcend partiality, fragmentation, particularity, and division by exercising the fragmenters. The bad reality of nationalism that is evidenced by the bad reality of nationalism that is evidenced by Israel the bad reality of nationalism that is evidenced by Israeli, just as any other nation-state realpolitik, is ideologically distilled into the imaginary pure essence of true heroic patriotism, such as, say, that of, quote, the Palestinians, end quote, versus the evil scheming of the anti-nation, quote, the Jews, end quote, as embodied in the people-eating imperialistic entity maliciously implanted into the Arcadian shores of the Mediterranean. Such almost cosmological dualisms are, of course, utterly unhelpful to either side of the actual conflict. In the current European context, associations between left-wing movements and the far right, anti-cosmopolitan, quote, revolt against modernity, end quote, are very much fringe phenomenon. Everything should be done to keep it that way. The currently most prominent context for anti-Semitism to materialize on the liberal and socialist left is that of supporting, or at least not opposing, the ultra-conservative in terms of economic policy, usually neoliberal, Islamist resistance to quote, West toxification, end quote, in diverse parts of the world at the cost of abandoning the trade unionists, feminists, Marxists, Jews, and gays whom this, quote, resistance, end quote, is out to kill. Islamism, like other forms of modern, quote, fundamentalism, end quote, developed in tandem with and took inspiration from the European anti-Enlightenment post-World War I conservative revolution, most prominently via its influential theorist, Sayyid Qutb. Far from being radical, its metropolitan supporters are traitors who have abandoned the Enlightenment's still largely undelivered promise of human emancipation. Many on the, quote, left... Well, let me do something real quick. Sorry, I just have to copy and paste this thing. Many on the, quote, left seem to take at face value the famous formula of imperialism as the, quote, highest stage, end quote, of capitalism, an un-Marxist concept devised for practical, not theoretical reasons by Lenin. Lenin adopted it from discussions with British New Liberalism, in particular that formulated in the context of the Boer War by the liberal anti-Semite Hobson. Of course, any committed anti-capitalist would want to fight capitalism where it is at its quote, highest stage, end quote, and if one believes this to be, quote, imperialism, end quote, then anti-imperialism has to carry more weight than good old-fashioned trade unionism, women's emancipation, and other forms of struggle that relate to capitalism's not-so-high stages. The stupidity of such a perspective is helped through the misleading rhetoric of, quote, stages, end quote, which suggests that the fundamental characteristics of capitalism, say the appropriation of the surplus product, i.e. the product of wage labor beyond the value of the wage, which means, in a modern society, most of it, have somehow become last year's snow. The term, quote, imperialism, end quote, bundles together a range of phenomenon, and likewise, quote, anti-imperialism, end quote, is a rather shape-shifting creature depending obviously on what it believes, quote, imperialism, end quote, to be. Some, following Marx's position, have accused European imperialists of preventing the global spread of the capitalist mode of production from destroying conservative social and cultural structures that stand in the way of human emancipation, notably clerical and other non-rational forms of cultural legitimation of domination. This was a critique of the fact that metropolitan capitalism is quite happy to keep in place and utilize, quote, traditional, end quote, social forms of oppression and domination in the periphery. Still in the 1970s, this was the predominant liberal and Marxist position. Cynical and greedy Europeans prevent capitalism from furthering capitalist development elsewhere, and therewith also the globalization of the conditions of overcoming capitalism itself. Others, by contrast, accused imperialism of actually doing what Marx had hoped it would do, globalizing a secular, more humane and liberating modernity that would sponsor the overcoming of the cultural and political muck of ages, as well as of modernity's own principal engine, capitalism. This seems now the predominant position of the, quote, left, end quote. Though imperialism, which is really just capitalism under a different name, is rejected because it destroys cultural identities and imposes universally identical imperial monoculture. This is the conservative critique of capitalist modernity that Marx spent a lifetime fighting against. Hegel would have relished the irony that anti-imperialism has become a brand name for cultural reactionaries in various parts of the world who learned from European revolutionary conservatives how to use reactionary aspects of Western modernity against its own, still largely undelivered promise of emancipation. He would have been more than a little surprised to see, though, that so many of his own liberal and socialist descendants support such people. Those who think that, quote, imperialism, end quote, is a valid category of analysis still must make any support dependent on what the social content of any particular anti-imperialist struggle is, in the name of which societal goals is the struggle being conducted. Differing from their ancestors in the 19th century, salad days of wild, brutal, and honest liberalism, the political parties of developed bourgeois democracy share with their totalitarian opponents the compulsion to deny their partiality. They profess to disdain representing interests, standpoints, bias, and in general, the icy waters of egoism that flow in the baptismal fonts of modernity. Although even progressive capitalists agree that, quote, the economy, end quote, needs nothing more than an army of thoroughly greedy and egoistic trade unionists who drive up wages and spending levels, particularity and partisanship are the devil in the sublime idealism of modern mass membership political parties. They work for the integration of society by whipping amour propre out of its constituents. Those by tradition seen as stubborn representatives of difference, even if they in fact want nothing more than being equal, are unlikely to be looked upon with grace by the nationalist spokesman of the harmonious commonweal. The more liberal of these modern nationalists will happily endorse the Jews' own nationalism as long as they put up their tents elsewhere, while others will find Jewish nationalism exceptionally, unacceptably, shockingly egoistic. It is just that little bit too particularistic. The national homeland of the eternal non-nationals cannot but disturb the eternal peace that liberals assume will result from granting all genuine nations their right to self-determination. Whether they happen in other respects to be, quote, right-wing or, quote, left-wing is accidental. Due to its spread in the large luggage of Western civilization, anti-Semitism has turned from a local problem of Europeans to a global issue, more pervasive than ever. It is perfectly in tune with the general dynamics of globalization that some Muslim immigrant groups in Europe would hire religious instructors from their spiritual or actual countries of origin who re-import to them, in translation, also some of the less attractive ideas that Europeans had developed in the 19th century to address the darker sides of rapid modernization. One of these time-honored European ideas is political anti-Semitism. If and when European Muslims adopt it, then it should be seen as a sign of their successful integration into a world system dominated by Europeans and explained by Western ideas. As liberal and socialist anti-imperialists know well, imperialism has a habit of shaping also the resistance to itself. Without doubt, though, current immigrants to Europe are as well able as anybody else to figure out which of the many contradictory things that the dialectic of enlightenment has produced, from brain surgery to the atom bomb, from multicultural society to the Holocaust, are emancipatory and useful and which are not, unless they are deprived of the breathing space to do so. If liberal society can defeat its own illiberalism, then enlightenment can still, quote, master itself and assume its own power, end quote, Horkheimer and Adorno, and figure out how to get to the, quote, better state of things where one can be different without fear, end quote, Adorno.